So welcome everybody. I'm Beth Ribet and I'm the Director of Repair, and I'd like to begin with a brief land acknowledgement. Repair acknowledges the Gabrielina Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tavangar, the Los Angeles Basin and the South Channel Islands. And we're grateful to have the opportunity to work for the Tarahatam, the indigenous peoples in this place. We pay our respects to Hanukvatam, the ancestors, Ahihiram, the elders, and Eohimkem, our relatives and relations, past, present, and emerging. I also want to announce that if anybody needs closed captioning to maximize your participation, you should be able to access that by hitting the closed caption tab at the bottom of the Zoom screen. There's a little caret just to the right side of it, and if you want to turn subtitles on, click show subtitles, and that information was also in your registration confirmation for this event. Okay, so as noted, I'm Beth Ribet, the Director of Repair. I just want to enthusiastically welcome everybody. Thank you for turning up on a holiday weekend. Thank you for turning up for a difficult subject. Appreciate and honor the fact that you're here. I'm going to turn things over now to Yasmine Vafa from Rights for Girls, who's going to add a bit more before we start our conversation today.
Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you all of you for joining us. I just want to thank Repair for bringing us together and providing space to discuss such an important topic, and one that I know is deeply personal to many of us on today's call. Survivors and allies have been working for a number of years towards the decriminalization and decarceration of survivors, and particularly sex trade survivors. It has long been our view that we do not criminalize people for acts of survival. And so many of us have been working for several years to provide greater resources, access, and opportunities, and particularly opportunities to exit the sex trade for both survivors here in the US and across the globe. We are going to spend today's conversation talking at length about some of these efforts, but I think this is important to realize that this isn't something that is new or new ground. Promoting decriminalization and decarceration of survivors is something that many of us have been working on for years, hand in hand with sex trade survivors. And it's also an area where we have seen many successes, including, vacator, sealing, and expungement of prostitution records, affirmative defenses for prostitution and related crimes, decriminalizing minors across the country for prostitution charges, and the creation of off-ramps and exit strategies out of the sex trade. And so today, it's a huge honor for me to be joined in conversation by several leaders in this movement that are going to help us shed a bit more light on this topic, and then talk about some of the work that still remains to be done. So with that, I want to kick it over to one of our other partners.
Should we just take a minute to let the four of us introduce ourselves? Yasmine, do you want to say a little bit more about who you are?
Sure. So I'm Yasmine Vafa. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Rights for Girls, which is a human rights organization based out of the Washington, D.C. area. And my work is primarily focused on examining the intersections between race, gender, violence, and criminalization. I'm one of the authors of the Sexual Abuse to Prison Pipeline, and so I've spent a good portion of my career working towards the decriminalization and decarceration of survivors of gender-based violence, particularly young women and girls of color. And I'm incredibly passionate about working on issues related to sex trade survivors and preserving dignity and justice for them.
Khara, I want to chime in.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Khara Jabola-Carolus. I'm the director of the Hawaii State Commission on the Status of Women, and we are a feminist government agency in Hawaii, which is a colony of the United States. I also am a co-founder of Affirm Hawaii, which is my prouder mantle than being a bureaucrat. And I am coming at this issue from a leftist perspective, from a transnational anti-imperialist feminist perspective, as a Filipina. I also want to just say that this issue, the sex trade, is incorrectly seen oftentimes as a peripheral issue in the left, but it's actually a core terrain of struggle between oppressed classes and oppressors. it's really the gladiator ring of the left. And so, you know, the sex trade is the foundational pillar of patriarchy, which is why it's so closely guarded. So you know, it's such an honor to be here with these women. These women, Mel, Beth, Yasmine, are the MVPs of the left, because this issue requires incredible strategy, brilliance, and strength. So just an honor to be with you.
So I want to let Melanie go last, just because she's also going to start off our conversation. So I'm going to briefly introduce myself, a little more than saying I'm the director of Repair. So I am a survivor of prostitution and pornography as a small child. Everything that happened to me happened before I was 10 years old. And I founded Repair, which identifies as a health and disability justice organization, in part because I came to understand very acutely that people like me, survivors, particularly those who'd experienced child sexual exploitation, were dying fast, dying prematurely, and struggling tremendously with physical and mental illness and disability while we did live. And though my individual entry into thinking deeply about that was as a survivor of the sex trade, I also feel deep kinship with people who've been tortured and people who have been, you know, just serially deprived and abused in a range of spheres. So Repair does a lot of work on issues like food and nutrition and criminal justice and, you know, broadly social change work. So those are the things that I'll say by way of entry, other than, you know, I speak often not just as a survivor, but as a person who's been disabled in many ways by violence and lives with more than a dozen health and disability diagnoses and continues to live. So with that, I'll hand it over to Melanie.
Thank you, Beth. And yes, I'm going to agree with Khara. This work is extremely tiresome at times and draining, but also very much needed. So I thank all of you guys for being my sisters in that. Hi, everybody. My name is Melanie Thompson. I am the Youth Outreach Coordinator at the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women International. I am also a survivor of domestic sex trafficking and prostitution here in the U.S. So with that, I think we're just going to jump right into this conversation because I know we'll have a great conversation. So I guess first I just want to talk a little bit about the criminalization of survivors and how criminalizing those who are exploited in the sex trade strengthens and sustains sexual exploitation. And we know for the longest time, currently in the 50 states, with the exception of a few rural counties in Nevada, that prostitution is fully criminalized in all of our jurisdictions. And the initial idea behind that was if you criminalize every party or actor involved in the sex trade, it would potentially eradicate the sex trade as a whole. And it was seen as a tactic or as a positive tactic. But what we know now is that full criminalization only further stigmatizes us, the people who are exploited, and continues to perpetuate the sex trade, because once we're released from either jail time or any type of mandation, we go back to the life. Why? Because under full criminalization, we are not offered any resources. So with this model, I know for me personally, it increased my dependence on my pimp. It increased the racism and the stigmatization that I received and discrimination I received post jail. So I guess I just want to put that in the air and just hear all of your thoughts on, that further criminalization of us and how that relates to the sustainability of the sex trade.
Well, I think, Beth, go ahead.
No, please.
So I was going to say, I think in the work that we've done with survivors, it's very clear that criminalization is completely counterproductive. It only keeps survivors entrenched in the sex trade, whether they're minors, whether they're adults. The arrest, adjudication, and criminal records follow them and impede abilities for them to exit, obtain housing, obtain employment. We've worked with survivors who are adults who exit the trade, have children, and, get pulled over, and it still shows up. They still get harassed. They still get stigmatized. The discrimination always follows them. And so it's really a counterproductive, incredibly harmful and unjust strategy that really serves no purpose other than to continue to put burdens on some of the most marginalized members of our community. And so that is something we continue to witness and something that we continue to very strongly oppose.
Yeah, and what I'll add is we have to think about, for a person who has been sexually exploited or is in systems of prostitution as a sex trafficking survivor, what does it feel like? What does it mean to be criminalized? You know, so, and there are a bunch of different levels to that answer. And one is just that we know how brutal policing is in the United States. We know how racist it is, how sexist it is, how much it's predatory in its relationship to poor, homeless, and working class and poverty class people. We know that cops sexually abuse people in systems of prostitution, and that the chances of any sort of redress or even, you know, a serious complaint are almost non-existent when the victims are already understood as criminal and as sexually wrong, sinful, criminal, all the sort of, you know, still extremely powerful tropes that we have in our society. So criminalization allows cops to prey on our people, allows more rape, more abuse, more molestation, more exploitation, and more harassment, more humiliation. Then what happens when you get as far as courts? One of the things that we see is that it's deeply traumatic for survivors to be before a court, having to defend yourself from the charge that you did something wrong by being exploited. The weight of that, having the society come to you and say, you know, explain your crimes, defend yourself against your criminal charges, when what someone is experiencing is often, you know, profound intimate partner violence at the hands of a pimp, serial exploitation, survival sex, right? All the things that people are going through. Then having the government come and say, answer for your crimes, for existing, for surviving. It creates a fundamental and almost irreparable distrust and experience of betrayal and trauma between survivors and the state. And that makes it unbelievably harder to do things like expose trafficking rings, hold perpetrators accountable. And it sends the society a message that people in systems of prostitution, people in the sex trade are shameful, right? That we have done something wrong, something deeply wrong. So I want to say that even when, you know, if there's not a sentence or there's mitigation or there's, you know, some sort of diversion program, even if you're not incarcerated, just the experience of going to court is traumatic. Then we can talk about what happens to survivors who are incarcerated. And what we know is that prisons, jails, and detention facilities in the United States are sexually violent spaces, deeply sexually violent spaces, whether between peers, between guards and staff. People in people who are incarcerated are sexually abused a lot. And the rates and patterns of abuse for people who have been or are in the sex trade when incarcerated are extremely high. Everybody sees you as fair game, right? If you were labeled as a prostitute and then you're incarcerated, people assume you have no sexual boundaries. And sexual boundaries are already getting crossed all the time. So what we see are just these serial experiences of trauma. Often people in the sex trade don't really have a lot of autonomy or control over whether they're protected from STDs, but when incarcerated, there's no protection. So we see folks coming out with syphilis, with HIV, with gonorrhea, with chlamydia, with, you know, I mean, just the full range of possible conditions. And we don't take care at all of people who are formerly incarcerated. So you don't get healthcare, you don't get treatment. And so the STD alone can kill you if the trauma doesn't, if the violent injuries don't. So what we see is that this punishment can rapidly become a death sentence and is a huge part of the equation of why our people are dying so prematurely. Why, like at the age of 48, I'm a movement elder as a survivor. Like nobody in their 40s should be an elder for anything yet. But I can point to so few people who are survivors, particularly kids survivors, little kid survivors, who are more than like 2, 3, 4, 5 years older than me. I have a long list of survivors I've worked with who didn't make it alive past 60, right? So understanding that this is a huge part of the landscape, that these institutions are killing us, that we absolutely have to stop criminalizing survivors because it's killing off the survivors. And if we're not here to speak, to give testimony, to name what's happened to us, one, we don't get to have whatever lives we can still have. Two, we're not here to stop. the abuses in the industries. For folks who are really thinking about how to end sex trafficking, how to stop sexual exploitation, this step is vital. We have to get our people out of the criminal justice system. Khara, I don't know if you wanted to add.
I'm just reflecting. That was very powerful. Criminalization is a performance. It's an excuse to pretend that the state cares about this issue, and it really isn't prohibition. We've talked about this, that really the only people who are held accountable and blamed for this system of violence are those being exploited. And so it is absolutely unjust. And I think everyone should know, who is being acquainted with abolition, should understand that we foremost want to decriminalize people who are being exploited. At the same time, we know that criminalization is not, or decriminalization of survivors is not a panacea. And so I'll turn it back to Mel to keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. And everything that you guys just said is definitely hard to hear, and sitting here reflecting on some of the things that I've experienced when it comes to police officers specifically, and just, thinking overall about the issues that we have with mass incarceration separate from the sex trade, and just that alone in and of itself is so much. And then thinking about how that doubles for individuals who are part of the sex trade or have engaged in the sex trade and then go to jail, or the amount of times that police officers use their badge as a way to manipulate you and use you for whatever it is that they want, and then still go and put you in a system of a jail system or the criminal justice system. And it's really upsetting, but it's also like expected. And that's where I think the problem is lying. There's a disconnect, there's a mistrust, there's all of these different things when it comes to the relationship between the criminal justice system, the courts, the judges, the police officers, and the women, especially Black and brown women, who have been exploited in the sex trade, and seeing how they use that as a tool. They rape us, they make us do all these things, and then they arrest us and give us a record as a way to continue keeping us suppressed and labeling us. And like you said, Beth, and not even just in jails, but anywhere that you go, once you have that record and you're labeled a quote unquote prostitute, you're automatically assumed to have no sexual boundaries, and you're automatically assumed to not ever have a choice or ever have a voice in anything that goes on with you. So just in thinking about that, it's just really, frustrating, because it's like we're not past this yet. And if anything, it is heightened in the last year or so since the pandemic. So it's something that needs to definitely be addressed. On both the minute scale and the systemic scale.
Thank you all so much for that. So I'm going to, just to the group, sort of reflect on the question of what does decriminalization mean? What is it that we're exactly calling for? And I'll start by saying that I'm not suggesting that everything about the sex trade should be legalized. What I'm saying when I say decriminalize is that we should not arrest, criminalize, incarcerate, or otherwise subject to criminal penalties anybody who is in the position of selling sex, of being sold for sex, of being prostituted, being trafficked, or being exploited. And one of the reasons that that's different from any legal model that we have now, besides the obvious fact that we criminalize survivors, is that even where we have exceptions to that, there, for instance, there are exceptions where if you can prove, which it's often hard to do, that someone is being sex trafficked, then that would immunize them from some kinds of criminal penalties, or would, sort of redirect them elsewhere in the system. But that requires the presence of a trafficker. And we have, for instance, a lot of runaway kids who are having survival sex, being used and exploited by adults who will give them food or shelter for the night. And there's no trafficker, there's no pimp. And so none of those kids are recognized as victims in laws that target trafficking survivors. So what we're saying is we need to not treat it as a crime to sell yourself or to be sold. And that doesn't mean that we're saying that it's okay to traffic or to pimp or to buy someone else. So we're not talking about a complete decriminalization of all activities. And, I think we should at some point in today's conversation talk about what are our relationships to the criminal justice system at large, that we won't be able to fully explore that. And what are some of the ways that we have to respond that aren't about trying to police at all or incarcerate as primary responses. But I wanted to start by making that clear. And then just wanted to hear from the rest of you about where you see the law landing on these questions now, what it's like to organize for decriminalization, and anything else folks who want to add about what you're calling for.
Well, I'm happy to jump in and just say, we've been working really hard around education. I think there's just so much misinformation and just a lack of understanding of the dynamics around the sex trade. What are the drivers? When we first started having conversations with lawmakers about the need to decriminalize people who, sell sex for acts of survival, there was this sense of, well, we don't want to attract more people to prostitution, right? They didn't understand that the legality of selling sex was not the driver. And so there's just a lot of education that we had to do. But I think one of the critical components is, understanding the need to not only decriminalize people who directly sell themselves or who are sold for sex, whether or not they're victims of trafficking. I think, those distinctions can be very harmful in, creating this dichotomy between who's deserving of legal protection and support, who is, adhering to that notion of an ideal victim versus, who is more culpable, blameworthy, who is quote unquote choosing, right, to engage in these behaviors, when in fact a lot of the research and evidence that we know from survivors is that many, if not most, of the adults in the sex trade today were the child sex trafficking victims of yesterday, right? There's this notion that once you reach age 18, it's all of a sudden an empowered career choice is just not the case, given all of the experience and information that we have before us. And so I think the important thing that we have tried to push in our advocacy and education is not just decriminalization, but decriminalization paired with services and exit support. I think that is often one of the components of our advocacy that is missed, that decriminalization of prostitution, of the sale of prostitution, in and of itself won't eliminate police contact with a marginalized population. Again, we know this from our success in decriminalizing children for prostitution offenses. Without services and exit support, those kids are just getting arrested, but for different things. They may not be getting arrested for prostitution, but they're getting arrested for theft, for loitering, for trespass, for running away, for truancy, for drug use, all kinds of different offenses. And so the same thing will happen to adults in the sex trade if we do not pair decrim with exit services and support, because so many of them communicate that they want to leave the industry, but can't and cannot, find ways to do that successfully and safely. And so I think that is and ought to be our ultimate goal.
I think when I think about decriminalization, full decriminalization of the sex trade, I believe that it's predicated on misconceptions of the sex trade, oftentimes similar to what our states thought with full criminalization, where they thought that taking everybody out of the equation would eradicate it, and it didn't. I think that a lot of people are thinking, well, if you fully decriminalize it, it makes certain things safer. It allows for more between police officers and those that are being exploited. It allows for our police departments to find victims faster. There's all these different things that people are saying that full decriminalization will do. And I think that we need to emphasize what Yasmin was just talking about. What would full decriminalization look like if you don't have exit services? And I think that really that's where this entire conversation lies. Even if you didn't ask about decriminalization, the reality is, how do we change what's actually happening in this system of prostitution? And the only way to change that is not just removing them alone, but removing us from the sex trade and still providing us with strategies and resources and all of the things that we didn't have that made us susceptible to being in the sex trade. Nobody wakes up and says that this is what I want to do forever because I want to, right? This comes from something. It's usually marginalized folks that the system of prostitution is targeting. It's predicated and it's fueled on and thrives on our vulnerabilities. Otherwise, there would be no sex trade. So we need to address the bigger vulnerabilities and the bigger risk factors that make us marginalized, so that prostitution does not seem like a viable option to any of us. And I think that oftentimes, a lot of people, when they hear decriminalizing this and decriminalize what they call sex work and all these things, oftentimes the justification and the reasoning behind that is because they say, well, we need money, we need things to live, this is my way of life, this is how I'm surviving. And the answer to that issue of needing to survive is providing us with these resources. It's not the system of prostitution, and it's not decriminalizing the system of prostitution. I think a lot of times people think that decriminalization is an answer to a bigger problem. Full decriminalization is a suggested solution to a surface level problem, but that's not actually tackling what's causing this to be a system in the first place. So it's a false misconception, because we know where full decriminalization was tried, it's not true and it failed. But we also know that no matter what framework you decide or what legislation you decide to support on the issue, without any resources or without any opportunities for those that you remove from the sex trade, all you're doing is just prolonging a chance for a higher recidivism rate. We're going to go back because we have no other option. So we need to really shift and think about what legislation or what solution or what actions can we take that address the bigger issue and address the fact that we don't have what we need to not go back. And a lot of times this debate on full decriminalization comes from the false misconception that if we fully decriminalize everything and everyone, it's going to be safer. There's no way to make prostitution safer. There's no way to regulate a person's body, especially once it's a commodified body. So we really need to just ask ourselves, we need to not listen to everything that we hear at first and really ask ourselves some bigger questions. Well, why do we want this to be something that's decriminalized in our society? Why do we want to normalize this? What is it that what's our goal with full decriminalization? And I think that if we ask ourselves those questions, then we'll dig deeper and find bigger answers to bigger problems.
I think I'll pick up here just to summarize and then pose my own question to you all. So, when we talk about decriminalization, we're talking only about oppressed classes. We're not talking about exploiters. And from our point of view, sex buying is inherently exploitative because you're taking advantage of extreme marginalization, transphobia, misogyny, systemic racism, all of these systems combining to access the bodies of vulnerable people. And decriminalization is being conflated of the exploited classes is being conflated with protecting the exploiters. And so when you hear decriminalization now, because it's been co-opted, it's really a Trojan horse for replacing the iron fist of the state with the invisible hand of the free market and letting the free market wreak havoc on extremely marginalized people. And so that is my word of caution. And just to clarify, I think what everyone was saying about, what we mean when we say decriminalization. And so with that, the question that I have is really around policy. So getting into concrete policy in order to have an effective approach. So, coming from a firm, an effective approach to us at its core has to shift power. It has to change the power relations between the exploited and the exploiters, not to mention a host of other basic ingredients. But I'd like to hear from you about what you think existing efforts, how have they been effective, what have been the results. In Hawaii, we did the first and only law to allow anyone who has sold themselves, been sold in prostitution, to vacate a prostitution conviction and expunge their record. So we're really proud of that first step. But what have you seen and what do you think is an effective approach? I will pick somebody if nobody volunteers. Yasmin, Mel.
I'm happy to go first, and Mel, I'm sure you can add a lot to this. But I think, you know, in terms of policies, going back to the misconception that I think we've been alluding to, there's this sense that, you know, our approaches to the sex trade have to be, you know, black or white, that we either have this full carceral prohibitionist approach that we currently see in almost every state, or it's full decriminalization or full legalization, which, you know, repeals all of the prohibitions against all aspects of the industry, including selling sex, pimping, pandering, purchasing sex, brothel keeping, right? And I think that that's a false choice. That the reality is there is an opportunity and much area for a nuanced, thoughtful, survivor-centered approach. And what all of the survivors that I've had the honor of working with and learning from over the last, you know, more than a decade have taught us about the need for this partial decriminalization approach, one that is mindful of the power imbalances and dynamics that underpin the commercial sex trade, that oftentimes those who are engaging in the sale of sex, whether it be due to coercion or poverty or circumstance, they're doing so because of a need to survive. And so it's our responsibility to recognize that exploitation and not criminalize that, right? That to support those individuals with what they're actually saying they need, which is other opportunities to live and support themselves outside of the commercial sex industry. And so that is what we as social justice advocates should be aiming for. And that is what I think, you know, there's a lot of promising global approaches. Certainly, this is like the prevailing global policy response towards the sex trade. It's something that we have seen result in a dramatic reduction in sex trafficking and other forms of sexual exploitation. You can also do it without promoting carceral responses. You can do this and hold people accountable without fueling the prison industrial complex. I think, you know, we just need to think outside of the binaries and really understand that there are very nuanced approaches we can take that are survivor-centered, that are mindful of the various power imbalances, the racial and gender disparities at play. I mean, we have a series of fact sheets and you know, data that supports the vast majority of people being bought and sold in the sex trade are women and girls of color, predominantly Black, Indigenous, and Latinx people of color, oftentimes coming from marginalized communities, marginalized genders. And the vast majority of those who are buying sex are white, upper to middle class men. I mean, we can find this from a number of jurisdictions. And so I think that's really important. It presents a very powerful indictment of what these populations look like, who has the choice, and who's operating without any choices, right? And so I think that is the policy approach that we are taking and we are promoting, you know, hand in hand with survivors.
And that policy approach for me is the equality model. And I think we'll probably talk more about this later in the conversation, but currently that is a proposed legislation that I'm supporting, which is that survivor-centered partial decriminalization approach. And I think that, you know, a lot of times people have the misconception that we want to criminalize or want to see more people like me criminalized in the system, and we don't. Everybody that knows me personally would know that I don't like the law. So, you know, it's a big misconception. We don't want to see people, especially Black people and Indigenous folks and brown folks, further in the jail system. We don't want to see that. And I think that fully decriminalizing it is not the answer, because if you do that, then you're also removing the accountability factor for the demand of the sex trade, which only makes it more easier and more open for them to continue to do it in another form or fashion. So really this partial decrim approach for me is super, super imperative, because it removes that stigma and decreases that putting me back in the system and throwing more of me's into jails, while also still keeping that notion that the demand, no, this is not okay, this is not acceptable, you cannot do this. To me, I don't understand why there's still so many talks about this when it comes to this framework, because it just makes sense. we're not telling anybody to go to prison per se, right? We are not trying to increase that. We want to remove the stigma. We want to offer services to those survivors and people who have lived experience. We want to continue to see people grow and gain their equity and equality and live sustainable lives so that we don't have to go back to all of the nasty and disgusting things that we've had to endure. So for me, like Yasmin was saying, taking a survivor-centered approach is the only thing that I would find successful. It's the only thing that has been successful. And it's what myself and so many of my other peers in the sex trade have said. This is what we need, right? The reality is like Yasmin said, it's not black or white, right? It's not this or this. The sex trade is complicated. There's a lot of different factors that play into that. There's a lot of different circumstances that people are coming from that may not all look linear or parallel to each other. However, the only way to address all of those different complexities and various circumstances and situations is to put survivors at the center, and is to recognize that all with the commonality and the common denominator within all of us was a lack of something, a lack of resource, a lack of stability, a lack of love, whatever have you. There is a lack of something, and I think that taking a survivor-centered approach would address that lack to fill that void, therefore eradicating the system of prostitution. So I think putting survivors in the center and really addressing those needs, the things that we need to no longer be marginalized, is what's going to be the most effective approach.
I want to also acknowledge how much survivor labor has gone into supporting the equality model. And so I'll add my echo to say that this is an important step. But I also want to acknowledge that it's not an endpoint, that it's a very relatively modest, step to start to mitigate the extreme harm that's been done to people in systems of prostitution and to the communities that we're always being drawn from. So when I think about what needs to go along with decriminalization, it's a very, very long list, which I know can be daunting. On the other hand, it's a list of basically everything that we need to do in order to have a future as a species and to have a world that we can live in which it would be unthinkable to sell children or adults for sex. But I'll point to some of the things I think need to be sort of front and center in our consciousness. And one is Indigenous sovereignty. We need to really understand that the roots of the sex trade in North America and Turtle Island were in colonization, that they set up a series of templates for how people would become prostituted and whores. It was built into the militarization of this continent and to the US and to the territories the United States invaded in the Pacific and around the world, some of which remain colonized, some of which are just subject to absolutely brutal imperial influence. That we have to really understand that the colonization process implanted the conception and ideology surrounding sexual exploitation, the practices, and we need to look to Indigenous leadership for how to, for the ways in which this needs to be changed. And we especially need to look to Indigenous survivor leadership. So I want to hold up, of course, the incredible work and writing of Christine Stark, who's been just the superhero and light and, precious person for child survivors for more than a quarter of a century, been out there when there were no child prostitution survivors able to give, reliable or steady or frequent testimony. Chris has been out there for us for so long and understands so much about how and why our world can change and needs to change. I also want to highlight the work of a little organization called Little But Mighty organization called Innovations Human Trafficking Collective, which is run by Indigenous survivors, including Sandy Pierce and Jerry Muma. And so, there's small and underfunded and amazing people and organizations who have answers for us about what policy looks like and where we need to go. The second thing I think we really urgently need to do is build and support deep conversations between survivors of the sex trade, leaders in the Black Lives Matter movement, prison abolitionists, and have all that be really led by Black feminist survivors. I don't want to dump more work on Melanie, but Black feminist survivors like Melanie, to really think about what does it mean to integrate the already extremely powerful platform for change in and out of the United States in a way that is going to recognize the roots of sexual exploitation in the slave trade, which have never been severed. And, talk about what does it mean to decriminalize in a way that's not still looking to our criminal justice system for solutions, which it doesn't pose. The fact that we are saying we don't want to decriminalize the entire industry now with nothing else in place to replace it doesn't mean I'm saying, hey, mass incarceration is going to solve our problems. It's not. We know incarceration doesn't make pimps and traffickers and buyers less violent. So we need to be building systems which really stop the problem, moving towards decarceration in general, and thinking about what is reparation, what is an end to poverty. And the last thing I'll highlight is that we have to make a massive, massive investment domestically and globally in mental health. We absolutely have to do that. We have so much unhealed trauma that drives people into exploiting others, so much unhealed trauma that keeps people from being able to resist exploitation. We have to make healthcare a basic right. We have to make it high quality. We have to make it accessible. We have to make a huge investment in supporting people of color and training in the mental health professions. There's a brilliant article that was published years ago by Jamie Lee Evans about trying to become a feminist psychologist, and the only feminist psychology program in the country is the only woman of color in the program, and realizing it was impossible to do. So we absolutely have to create approaches to mental health that are explicitly anti-racist and feminist, and we have to fund it and invest in it. I could really keep going with my list of everything that's important to make the world better, but I think that's enough of a sample for now. So I will turn this back to Yasmine, who I think has more to raise for us.
Sure, and I think, we touched a lot about, our concerns with a full decriminalization of the industry, including decriminalizing and offering legal protection to exploiters. But maybe we can talk a little bit more about the practical implications of decriminalizing sex buyers. There's a lot of momentum around this issue. We've seen several district attorneys promoting policies to do this. We've seen recommendations come out and legislation being offered. But I think it's important that we recognize the practical implications of that. First, I think many people don't understand that we have experimented with full decriminalization of prostitution in the United States. In fact, Rhode Island experimented with this between the period of 1989 to 2009. They sharply reversed course in 2009 after finding multiple instances of child sexual exploitation. Providence became a sex tourism hub in New England. We know survivors from the DC area that were brought to Rhode Island and trafficked explicitly due to their laws. We know the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children remarked on how difficult it was for them to be able to recover children during their national child sting operations because of the laws in Rhode Island. And so, this is something that we've saw the Rhode Island, the Craigslist killer happened during that period of time. And so this has been tried and it's been a failure. And I think it's important that we recognize the links between sex trafficking and prostitution. Many people don't readily understand that sex trafficking exists because the demand for commercial sex already outpaces the supply, meaning that even though it's virtually illegal to buy sex everywhere, there are enough people, and predominantly men, perfectly content to break the law in order to buy sex, that there is already not enough willing participants, right, to meet that demand. And so that's why sex trafficking exists. If we were then to repeal those laws, those prohibitions against sex buying, those numbers would go even higher, right? More men enter the market as new clients through sex tourism, through neighboring jurisdictions. It's why we know that in places like Germany, there are 1.2 million sex buyers per day, right? Those individuals are not being serviced by consenting adults. And so I think it's really important to understand those practical implications. And so I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about what happens when we decriminalize buyers? What else is happening on this front? And how does this impact some of the other issues we talked about, like police abuse, and the impact on survivors?
Right now, what I'm seeing is not enough being done to tackle the demand. And I really want to uplift what you were saying, Yasmin, because a lot of people are not recognizing the severity of the role that buyers play in our exploitation. Oftentimes, when we think about decriminalizing the perps, we think about the traffickers, we think about the pimps, we think about the managers, the people that are driving the cars, but we're not thinking about the harms that sex buyers impose onto us. And also, I think it's important to note that sex buyers are not necessarily just buying the act of sex. They're buying this abuse of power of somebody that's over somebody that's vulnerable, which makes a lot of the acts that they are paying for, quote unquote, a lot more vicious than what we think or what our media portrays. So when we think about decriminalizing buyers, we really have to. I really wish sometimes that I can take everybody that we ever speak to and just take them with me on one day in the life so that they can see the severity of it, because I don't think there's any words to really get anybody to fathom that kind of abuse. And when we talk about decriminalizing them, all I think about is my state, our states being like a new sex tourism destination. We see what Germany already looks like. I cannot tell you how many people I know who have gone to Amsterdam for vacation and all they have back to report are red light district stories. And it's really disgusting when you think about it, but it's also something that we need to be more aware of so that we can see the harms of buyers. If we had people listen or look at John review boards and some of the things that they say, we wouldn't want to be decriminalizing these people. But I think that we need to really talk about and really have more conversations around the role that they are playing, as well as what would our society look like if we were decriminalizing them. So currently here in New York, in my state, they're still under full criminalization here in New York. But there's a lot of push for full decrim of everybody. There's also current smaller local laws and guidelines about potentially not criminalizing first offender buyers and things like that. So it's really complex right now because there's so many different approaches in my state to this issue. But I think that we really need to uplift the harms that they inflict on us for people to truly understand what they would be doing if they fully decriminalize the people that are continuing to buy us. Because the thing is, even without their dollars, there would be no pimps or people that are being exploited. So it's really them that hold a majority of the control in this. And I don't think that we have, I don't think that we're shedding enough light on the severity that of the role that they play.
I would just add to all of that brilliance that, I think that decrim versus criminalization is the wrong frame. And I would love to see us leave that as a movement at some point soon, because I think Beth really hit it on the head that it's really about land and body sovereignty. What we're talking about when we say sex trafficking and prostitution, people want to separate those and say they are not interconnected at all, but really they are just two different doors into the same house, and that house is the sex industry. And there was no sex industry in Hawaii until there were buyers. And so if we don't address buyers, we will continue to have this flow of people who are being hurt and harmed. And so, if we don't turn off the spigot, then we're just going to be dealing with this, until the end of our careers and lives. And I certainly don't want to be playing whack-a-mole like that. And there are just too many sex buyers, frankly. We know in Hawaii, we did research here and we found that 1 in every 11 men is actively looking to buy sex online. No one believes, not even the police, believe that we can arrest our way out of that or want to do that, because it really is about rape culture, like Beth highlighted in the chat. And so, for us, it's really about how are we going to shift that culture and create a new culture of accountability, in its place.
The only thing I would add to these fantastic comments are, oh, muted. The only thing that I would want to add is just to say that I think that, first of all, I heartily agree with Khara that we need to get past these frames. And I also think one thing we need to start to explore is civil rather than criminal responses to sex buyers. I think we need to make sexually exploiting others very, very expensive when you're caught doing it. I think we need to create cause of actions which both individuals, municipalities, and states can pursue. And I think that in the capitalist system we're all navigating right now, that's a powerful imperative to stop. Because most people, again, even if we had the capacity or desire to arrest everyone, and I don't, one of the things that I think is, and I'm just not about solutions that are about feeding the criminal justice system, which I think is irreparably broken, but looking for solutions which dismantle the economic systems that keep people in systems of prostitution. It's not a total solution, but I think it's a powerful strategy. And again, it can be about individuals taking, pursuing a cause of action against a perpetrator, but it can also be fines and using that money to feed into systems that we need, that are not criminalizing anybody, but that are anti-poverty, that are about reparation, are about Indigenous sovereignty, that are about the safety of children and youth, and that are about combating rape culture and gender violence. And we haven't talked much yet today about trans populations, but I think that that's a really important part of the piece, that we have to create economic safety nets for transgender people. And this is one of the ways I think we can fund it.
I actually just wanted to, before I open anything new, I want to, I wish I can put the emoji with the 3 exclamation points to show that I actually and highly agree. Because a lot of the times when we think about, a lot of people think that just arresting the buyers alone is the solution, but really in reality, most of them are white collar dudes, first time offenders, or the first time they've gotten caught, and they go and they serve whatever their bullshit sentences and then come out and do it again because they have the means. We need to, like you said, under capitalism, really just hit them where it hurts, in conjunction with continuing to hold them accountable. And that's the only way we're really going to see true change. And while we're talking about this notion of criminalization of sex buyers, I want to just open this up and really talk about what we can share with people that have a commitment to defunding the police and abolishing the prison industrial complex. And I think we all were touching on this a little bit. None of us, if I can speak for all of us, don't want to continue fueling our criminal justice system or our prison system in the U.S. in the U.S. And, for me personally, I am very pro prison and police abolition. However, I also recognize that under this current system that we have, it's not, a lot of people like to go back and forth between abolition and police reform, prison reform, whatever have you. The issues that I have with that are that we cannot reform a system that was founded on not serving us, right? This system was intended to, back in enslavement days, catch runaway slaves, that has now translated to continuing to keep Black and Brown and Indigenous folks oppressed. And I think that under the system that we have, we need to continue to uphold this accountability factor while we are in the process simultaneously of fighting to change the bigger system. But right now, we cannot, in the interim of us trying to fix this system that's been broken at its inception, we cannot just say, well, while we're working on this bigger issue, nobody has consequences for anything. And I think that that's where this conversation needs to come together, because a lot of times when we talk about prisons, right, and a lot of times when we talk about the system of prostitution, a lot of people love to bring this narrative into it, talking about the notion of the prison industrial complex, talking about police officers. And because I support a model that continues to hold buyers and perpetrators accountable, I'm automatically equated to somebody who is pro-policing or like prison reform versus abolition. But the reality is, it's not going to happen overnight, as the system that we've had in place has not been just in place for one night. It's been in place for hundreds and hundreds of years. So in the interim, yes, I want to abolish the prison system as well as I want to abolish the police system. However, the reality is, under capitalism especially, that's not going to happen tomorrow. And between now and tomorrow, there needs to be some level of accountability for the people that are continuing to hurt other people. So I think that we really need to, when we talk about prison abolition, prison reform, defunding the police, I think that we need to also recognize the importance of how we need to utilize them, for lack of a better word, while we're fixing this bigger issue, because we're not going to be able to change it and overnight. And in the process of trying to change it over whatever amount of years it's going to take, I still want to make sure that people that are exploited are safe and don't have to continue to be exploited thereafter.
I want to just say a huge, oh, go ahead, Khara.
Real quick, I love that framing, because there's such an analogy here too. We see like the Green New Deal everywhere, right? And it's about a just transition, a realistic just transition. And, and people saying that oil jobs are dangerous and workers deserve better. And that, we can't do this in one day. So at the same time, we can't deregulate and remove penalties for corporate polluters and exploiters. So why can't we have this same exact social justice approach to the sex industry, which is another destructive industry? So your just transition framing was just so great, Mel.
And if I can jump in really quickly, I mean, I completely agree. And I think, there's a lot of really powerful conversations happening in the prison and police abolition movements around how reform isn't sufficient, right? Like, we can't just stop at harm reduction. We have to strive to, you can't, reform violent, oppressive, racist institutions, right? That we have to strive towards harm elimination. And I think, one of the things that I think many of us would like to see more is a recognition of the sex trade as another violent, racist system of oppression, where we can't just stop at harm reduction, right? Harm reduction is critical and important, but we have to strive towards harm elimination. And so that looks like abolition in both of those systems. And I think they're completely compatible. I think we can work towards both, that these movements are actually compatible in more ways than we realize.
Not just compatible, I don't actually think either can work if they don't work in tandem, right? The mass, being arrested for being sexually exploited is one of the very most common entry points to incarceration for girls and women of color. Like, to even be having a conversation about abolishing the prison system, but wanting to leave the sex trade intact as it is, it doesn't make any kind of sense. So yeah, I think we absolutely have to integrate the work. And I just wanted to just do it. Thank you to everybody, and huge amen or a woman to Melanie around the question of the fact that we've got to have intelligent and thoughtful and heartful transitions. And I really love the work of Aurora Levens-Morales, who talks about how much good activist work fails because we rush and don't take the time to plan carefully, to work on trauma. And it's a tightrope because the need for change is, 100 years old, 200 years old, the reason why we have a sense of urgency and needing things to change right now is incredibly powerful. But nevertheless, if we don't plan carefully, our solutions fail. So we have to change things in carefully thought out stages, not to take 50 years to plan them, but to sit down, to get all the stakeholders together, to not silence people who are saying things that are going to complicate the picture, and then to really come up with plans that work. And I've been seeing this on the ground here in Los Angeles. So we've had a dysfunctional, not surprisingly, district attorney's office for a long time. And I voted for a candidate named George Gascon, who promised more of a, deep reform to prisons and policing. And in many respects has been delivering on that promise and facing a lot of resistance. But I can't say I was shocked, though I was really heartbroken to hear that he basically said, I won't prosecute first-time sex buyers with no alternatives, not I will divert them into educational programs or have them give money to victim services, just I won't prosecute. And then the cops locally are saying, well, we just can't arrest them because they're not going to be prosecuted because there's no point. And then they're asking sex buyers, have you ever been, have you done that? Is this your first time doing this? And if they say yes, then they're deciding that that's sufficient. And of course, we still see survivors being arrested in LA. Right. So, really talking about like, no, we need to not just say, oh, well, legalize everything, no accountability. And we've seen a really disturbing trend. While it's coming through very strongly around the sex industries, I've heard people saying we should decriminalize rape, decriminalize domestic violence, and even people saying, and this is not new, actually, saying decriminalize pedophilia, decriminalize child sexual abuse. We need to talk more about what it means to criminalize and just more about what it means as people, as communities, to say what our rights and wrongs are, what our boundaries are, how we'll protect each other. Those are deep conversations, that the solution is not just to say violence is okay.
So I think I'm up. So with as we come to near a close, to talk about what policy and communal steps need to be taken to redress at least some of the harm done to survivors by criminalization and incarceration. I will preface by saying, I think it's clear that survivors need to be in the driver's seat on this. And in Hawaii, we did an intensive survey that was qualitative of 22 survivors 2 years ago, who laid out very, very clearly and described in detail what needed to happen and where all the gaps were in the failings and the injustices. So we have a blueprint there here. And I'm wondering what you folks have to weigh into that. I also think, the government institutionalized systems of sexual slavery. And so it is appropriate to talk about reparations and even perhaps a reparations commission being established just on this issue. But I'll stop there and I see Beth nodding. Beth, did you want to jump in?
Oh no, I was just loving listening. I wish you could talk for a few more minutes about it, though. I know we have finite time, but just the idea of a reparations commission is amazing.
I was scared to talk about it. I was like, should I talk about it? But the last time I took international law before I had kids, and so I was scared to talk about it with a lawyer on the panel. But yeah, I think we need to be bold, and we need to change the conversation dramatically. But yeah, Mel, Yasmine.
Go ahead, Mel. I mean, I think I already said it before. I think for us, it's just, I have to echo, just working shoulder to shoulder with survivors and making sure that the voices of those who have lived the harms of the sex trade are the ones, really driving the policy responses. And I think every jurisdiction is different, right? I think there's a lot of areas where, we have created the foundation for a lot of really important change. But I think just working with survivors and letting them lead on this is incredibly important, and something that, we're seeing in pockets around the country. I know Massachusetts, a survivor-led coalition, just introduced their version of the equality model. New York, Maine has also introduced some legislation. There's some really interesting and powerful organizing that's happening in Michigan. They just had a conference this week that a number of survivors were, instrumental in putting together. And so I think elevating that and supporting that leadership is absolutely critical.
I saw Beth going.
I want to hear Melanie first.
No, but yeah, I just echo what both of you said. And I think you know, it may sound cliche to be like, put survivors at the center, but it's necessary. And every time we've seen, and obviously like what we have currently in place, we've seen what happens when you don't put survivors at the center and the policies that come out of that and that roundtable. And I think a reparations commission is super, super dope. I didn't even think about that. Um, I think we're a long way from there as a culture, period. But I definitely think that, as you said earlier, Beth, we need to make the crime of sex buying expensive. And I think it can start there. And I think that in terms of just a minute reparation, just having that fine scale for sex buyers, taking the money that they were using to commodify me and so many other people and putting that back into victim services and putting that into a fund that we can use to continue our mental health, um, uh, I don't know what the word is, like counseling and getting therapy and putting money back into our pockets, into jobs and things like that, so that we don't have to ever see that person again, or that kind of person again. And I think that once we look at what survivors need, once we talk to survivors, once we fully educate ourselves on the complexities of this issue, then I think that more suggestions on how you can give back, in a sense, to the people that were exploited will come.
I think we need to talk about corporate accountability. I think folks think about prostitution happening in a localized and individual way. The, kind of classic Department of Justice and law enforcement representations are of Black pimps and, Mexican or brown people who are coyotes, and that those are the criminals and those are the enemies. And when I think about pimping and perpetration, first of all, the largest perpetrator in the world is the US military. But we also have to talk, but I mentioned corporate accountability. And, we also need to talk about AT&T. There've been, I don't think it's still true now just because the internet is so diversified, the spread of sources of pornography. But there was a period where AT&T broadband was the single largest purveyor of pornography in the United States. And there's no question that some of that content involved direct sexual exploitation. And I could unpack that more if we had time. And of course, there's never been an accountability about it. They've never even been boycotted. They barely got letters. They certainly didn't have to pay back survivors who they were streaming out to TV channels around the country. So thinking about the role of corporations, thinking about, the ways in which power structures that really are set up to defend the privileges of white males are culpable, I think is vital. Someone earlier in the chat said something about labor rights, and I want to address that really carefully, because I think that labor rights are vital. I'm a longtime union member and organizer. But I think that we need to stop thinking that labor rights in and of itself are sufficient to protect people who are being sexually exploited. First of all, labor rights should be there for people who want to labor. And to begin with, most of the survivors I know reject the idea that we should frame our experiences as labor. And I do that so deeply I can't express it. But so while we absolutely need to combat poverty, and one of the ways to do that is strengthening the labor movement and labor rights, we need to really talk about changing the fundamental conditions that make people vulnerable to exploitation. And we can't do that if we are still framing this as a job. And I say that partly as somebody who was being abused as a toddler. I was not legally capable of any kind of work, right? Nor was the problem with me being raped and tortured that I wasn't getting a minimum wage for it. But for teens, for adults, one of the things we do is we sort of don't see the ways in which capitalism eats our bodies across a lot of different spheres, that people have rotten choices. But as long as they're making some kind of choice, then that's okay. So you can overwork someone to death. You can overwork someone to, into a heart attack at the age of 50, and that's allowed. And so what I would say is that we need to give people such a wide range of economic choices that we won't ever see anybody be economically vulnerable to exploitation. But if we do that, that alone isn't going to eliminate all exploitation. So labor rights need to be part of the landscape. But not all sexual exploitation is commercial, right? Some are child prostitution and pornography rings who are just trafficking and moving kids around for their own purposes, and money isn't part of the factor, but it is organized. It produces pornography, which is disseminated, or sometimes money is made, but it's a sort of afterthought, right? So understanding that we have to recognize capitalism is sustaining the sex industries, but we can't reduce this to capitalism in a way that really fundamentally ignores patriarchy and white supremacy and the hypervulnerability of children. So that's a piece that I would add. And I wanted to just come back to the group. We have about 15 minutes, so I wanted to just invite everybody to add anything that you would want to, what's on your mind as we're closing conversations or thinking about next ones, including like learning and reading recommendations.
If I could just jump in on the labor rights issue, I think, that's a really critical point, and it's something that we've been hearing more and more. And there's been a lot of really brilliant survivors and scholars that have written about this issue, that have talked extensively about this issue. But a lot of them will say, and I agree, that sexual exploitation is not compatible, right, with labor rights. And there was actually an effort, I think several years ago, with CAP International had organized, I think, more than 25 of the biggest global labor unions that all signed a statement making unequivocally clear that prostitution was incompatible with labor rights, that all of the protections that employees and workers are protected from in the workplace are incompatible with prostitution and a life in the sex trade, that those are the very job descriptions of individuals who are in the sex trade. And so it's essentially quid pro quo, right? And as an attorney and as somebody who runs an organization, I can tell you that it is quid pro quo. It's sexual harassment. And so it's just fundamentally incompatible with labor rights. And so I think that's more of just a provocative talking point that we're hearing from the sex trade lobbyists, but that it is in so many ways incompatible. And for many of the brilliant points that you made, Beth, right, there's just so many reasons why being in the sex trade is incompatible with having actual labor rights. And many labor organizers have spoken on this powerfully.
I'll chime in too. Only 4% of domestic workers are organized in unions, and the sex industry does not lend itself to unionization, even more so than domestic work, as it's referred to in the US. The majority of buyers have access to sex already because they are partnered or married, and they are not interested in being held accountable, in participating in above board, transparent industries where they are known. And so there will always be this push to have this existing off the books, underground, regardless of whether they are criminalized or not. And so, unionization is not going to solve the hideous violence that is systemic across this industry. Neither are labor rights, as Beth and Yasmin so eloquently said. And the term sex work is so inaccurate and does not capture the majority of the experiences of the sex trade, which is why we haven't been using it here and for other reasons. And also because socialists and labor movements have never considered prostitution part of wage labor, because it's what you do when you are so discriminated against that you cannot engage in wage labor. So you have to do the only thing left, which is sell your home, your body. And so it's been seen as uniquely exploitative and a condition of oppressed classes based on sex and gender exploitation that needs to be tackled uniquely. And so, for all of these reasons, I think that those points are very important to raise.
And not just on this question, I'm also just wondering sort of what your last thoughts are as we start to close this conversation.
I think overall, I would just say continue listening to survivors and coming to more conversations like this. Really question what full decriminalization would look like if made our main governing policy. Do more research on the severity of the role that buyers play in the sex trade, and really ask more questions when we talk about prostitution as work, and really do your research on why that could never be. And seeing the reality of the harms, not just what's shown on TV and not just what the news is putting out, because they, of course, only cover one part of the story. So really just more education is what I'm pushing for.
So I'm going to share a pretty personal story. On May 8th of this month, I was getting out of a Zoom meeting and I started having a lot of trouble concentrating. Like even just from moment to moment, I was having trouble remembering what I had just been saying or what the other person had just been saying. And I thought I must be really overtired. And I got out of the meeting and I got some water and I was like leaning back and I thought maybe I should eat something. And I did that, but I felt really dizzy and light on my feet. And I finally called up a good friend who is a medical doctor and said, I think I'm not okay. And as I was talking to her, I started getting sicker and sicker. The whole room was spinning and it was getting, I could breathe, but I was having to like push my chest open, right? So I had labored breathing and I was kept forgetting what was happening. Like I would realize, oh, I'm holding the phone, what's going on? And remember that I was talking to my friend and I kept repeating, oh, I think I'm having an emergency. So we finally decided I should call 911. And that took a bunch of tries. I was holding up my cell phone and I couldn't figure out which icon to press to get the phone. So I was sort of like, I think I just opened the clock. And then I was able to dial the numbers 911. And then it took me 3 tries to give the 911 operator my address. And you all have been hearing me today. I'm used to being a really articulate person. And, you know, I have a lot of disability and health issues, but I'm used to being able to think. So this was really disorienting. And I remember being afraid and the paramedics showed up and they were working me up and, you know, I sort of forgot what was happening and came to, and I'm like, whoa, I'm having an EKG and my shirt's up and there are men I don't know in my apartment. So it's this really deeply disorienting experience. And they took me to the emergency room and I was in the ambulance and I was coming in and out of being able to think and noticing pressure in my chest and trying to breathe. And I stopped and I thought about my loved ones and my ancestors. And I thought, I could be dying, but I'm not going to die today. And then I thought, someday I will, though. I'm going to run out of time. Someday this is going to happen. And it's going to be the end. And I felt surprisingly peaceful. I didn't feel afraid of death. The only thing that really struck me was that I knew there was work I still needed to do. I thought, I can't die yet. I have work that I need to get done. And I actually thought about the fact that this conversation was coming up and the series that this is a part of, and forgive me, folks, if I get a little teary. I thought about each of the people I'm speaking alongside with today. I thought of Yasmine and Khara and Melanie, who I consider friends, but haven't known for years and years. But I thought about the work that they're doing and why I believe in what we're saying. And I thought, I can't die until the term sex work dies. That's got to stop. I actually thought that. I'm in this ambulance. I'm trying to breathe. I thought I have to live until I see that happen. We've got to lose that language. We've got to have an abolition movement. And it doesn't scare me to die. And if I see that that's happening, when I die, then I won't worry about, am I still needed here on the planet? And as I was preparing for this, I went back and I looked at something really beautiful that I turn to a lot, which is this letter that Alice Walker wrote to Barack Obama in 2009 about torture. And she wrote, if word reached me that you were being tortured, I would instantly feel tortured myself because I would be. Torture is something an entire society feels, whether we're within an earshot of the screaming or not. People don't like to believe this, that there is no way human beings can remain unaffected by what is done to other human beings or even to animals who are not human. If I heard this about you, I would do everything in my power to come to your aid. Not simply because I know you to be rare and necessary to our planetary survival, but because you are simply a person with feelings, aspirations, sorrows, and dreams. And she has a beautiful poem that she wrote afterwards about torture, which is one of those, rare experiences I get to have as somebody who's experienced a number of forms of torture, because they don't hold back in what they do to little kids in the sex industries. They're trying to train us to perform, and they do that using drugs and near-death experiences and choking and suffocation and a lot of other things that I don't talk about in public. But I've been healing and living and being a torture survivor and trying to keep my body alive in order to do this work. And so the thing that I would want to say to folks is we need to stop letting anything stop us from focusing on what's most important, which is the sex trade is a place where people are tortured, and it is built into the structure of systems of prostitution that some people will be tortured as long as it exists. It doesn't have to be everybody. That's not the point. We don't say if 90% or 50% or only 10% of people are tortured, then we can keep it going. This is a place that generates torture. And to bring it back to our theme today, to criminal justice systems, we take people who have often been tortured, certainly been raped and exploited in many circumstances, and we put them in places where we also know that the United States government perpetrates torture, allows people to be raped and abused, allows people to be pimped because there are active sex trades in systems of incarceration, to be deprived of decent food, to be shackled if pregnant, to be isolated, to be abused, to be beaten, to be routinely humiliated. We torture people who have already been tortured. This should be recognized as a massive human rights emergency. Every social movement should understand it's intolerable. We have to unite around that. And I plan to try to keep living for, as long as I possibly can, and I'm taking great care, and I'm lucky to have the privilege of decent medical care and a lot of support around me. But it's really urgent, not just that we have survivor-led systems, but that more of you step up and follow the model that Yasmine and Khara are embodying so powerfully. We need real allies. We need people to speak up for us. We need people to understand that this is part of your social justice work, because we're injured. The survivors are injured. It's not easy to go public and to tell our painful stories. It's not easy to cry. It's not easy to make this our usually unfunded work. So we need our allies to start to speak out, to challenge disrespectful language, to challenge the way in which the issue of systems of prostitution is avoided within the left, to insist that it has to be part of every agenda. It's really important that we do that, because notwithstanding the vulnerability of my body, I'm one of the lucky ones. I'm one of the ones on the outside. People who are at least as injured, if not more than me, are incarcerated and are going to die there. So if you're free, if you're out, this has to be your work. You have to decide it matters to you. And that's it for me.
I don't want to follow that, Beth, but I also want to make a commitment to you personally and also politically to the survivor community. And I want to just assert first and foremost that children, women, trans people, gender nonconforming people, Native, Black, women of color are not men's rehab centers, period. And that we have a right to fight the boot off of our neck by whatever means necessary and as boldly as possible. And you can consider the whitewashing colonial term sex work dead. We need you here with us, though. That doesn't mean you get to rest, Beth. I do want you to rest, though. And I thank you for opening up what you just went through. But I need you to help me with the reparations commission. So But anyway, just thank you to everybody. I'll stop myself, but thank you so much, Beth, for convening us, for organizing these incredibly helpful, insightful, and powerful sessions where we get to organize and share our thoughts candidly, and have really tough discussions with each other. Thank you, Mel, for being on the front line every single day, and Yasmin. And that's it. But aloha, everybody, and thank you again.
Yasmin, anything you want to close with?
I just want to, just to reaffirm our commitment, right? We are unapologetic about centering the most marginalized in our policy and advocacy work. We do not create public policies for those who are privileged or those who are, making a choice out of endless other options. We center the most marginalized. And we are very unapologetic about that. And that is how we're going to continue doing our work. And so that is the commitment that I'm here to affirm in our work, both organizationally and personally. And it's just such an honor to be able to share this space with all of you and to do this work alongside you. So thank you again.
That's it for me. You guys all took that. That's put everybody's opinion together, and those are my dots. So thank you all.
So Repair is going to be taking a little bit of a break while I heal, but we still have one event left this month. And so I want to invite folks to join our next convening of our civics project, which teaches people about law and policy and government in the United States. And I'm really excited because I get to interview Dr. Janine Abrams McLean about the US Census. And folks usually know the name Stacey Abrams because duh. But she's one of three amazing sisters, and her sister Janine Abrams McLean is just really brilliant analyst about the census and voting rights. So I'm tickled pink that she's joining us this Sunday at 2 o'clock Pacific, 5 o'clock Eastern, and I hope some of you will turn out. I will share the link for that for those who registered in the follow-up email, but you can also find links to all of our upcoming events here. I'm putting that in the chat for everybody. And for folks who watch the recording later, you'll be able to find it in the information accompanying the video. If you missed part of this conversation or want to share it with others, the recording should be live in an hour or two on our YouTube archive. And again, if you registered today, you will get the recording link. Just want to say a huge thanks to three really just absolutely incredible women, and have to give a special just moment of acknowledgement to Melanie. It's really not easy to be, I didn't come out as a survivor until I was like 41, 42. So I just am so continually grateful and heartbroken for, I know everything it must take for you to be doing the work now as you're also just continuing to heal in some basic ways. And to ask folks to keep following Melanie, following her work, supporting and funding her and recognizing her in all the ways that you can. And again, just want to acknowledge two of my very favorite organizations, Affirm and Rights for Girls, not least for supporting the presence of Khara and Yasmin today. So thank you, everybody, and take great care of yourselves.